Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, and again, my co-host today is Lieutenant Colonel Steve Young. Our last episode was on reconstitution during World War I, and then we went down some absolute rabbit holes, which was absolutely awesome. And then talking about mobilisation, or what would it look like if we were to invoke the 1930s and 40s, I suppose, in today's context. I suppose I want to shift tack somewhat slightly to you're obviously post-command and unit command, and it's that perfect, in military officer pedagogy, we talk about people teaching us things that are just ahead of us. I suppose you're not that far out of unit command, but I want to talk about growth and link it back to your days as a CO. Like, what does growth look like, or what does a battalion look like in your personal observations when we go into that growth, trying to grow the army sort of thing?
I think for me, if I look back on my time as a CO, the most enjoyable thing was spending time with junior officers easily. And that's nothing against soldiers or junior NCOs. It's just that your capacity as a CO to directly influence 2-3 levels down becomes harder, and your influence probably dilutes because of that. The lesson that I think I mostly learnt about expanding an army, though, is it actually comes from some of the PT sessions that we did. So I don't know if you remember, you might, Todd. There was a mill skills competition where we put in a team of lieutenants, and you guys kindly invited me to some of your training sessions, which was not overly enjoyable to throw body armour on and start rolling around and doing these circuit laps that you guys were doing. I
think the PT session that I know, and I do remember it, but the PT session you're directly referring to it's called an evolution circuit. So you start like leopard crawling, and then you get the ability to monkey crawl, and then you eventually get the ability to sort of walk, but that crawling and then subsequently monkey run is not a super easy activity on the body either. And then through ropes in there and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, sorry, continue. I didn't want to specifics.
So you bang on, and I can remember my pride just ebbing away as I was probably still leopard crawling and maybe monkey crawling at the time when you and there was two others, Reece Turner and
Connor Van Ryn.
Connor started lapping me. It was a disappointing moment, and a reminder that actually when you're in your early 40s trying to play this game, it's difficult. But that then sort of reminded me of a piece of work, or two pieces of work actually, that two great Australian historians have done, one called Will Westerman and one called Garth Pratton. Will looked at the First World War. He did a study on battalion commanders and what it took for a person to be successful as a battalion commander in the first Australian Imperial Force. And one of the most interesting things to me was that the battalion commanders in the 1st Division that hit the beaches at Gallipoli were 48 years old. 48 years old.
Which is about what, I suppose, now-ish.
So now I think you'll find that an infantry CO will age between about 37 and about 45 is roughly speaking the window, with no firm sort of, hey, you're too old now, but some rough rules that, hey, this is...
unspoken sort of.
Yeah. This is going to be tough on your body sort of thing. By 1918, so the Battle of Amiens, the average age of a battalion commander then in the 1st Division is 31 years old. So it's a 17-year difference. And if you look at those 48-year-olds at Gallipoli, a significant portion of them were medically evacuated off, not through wounding, but through illness. Essentially, their bodies couldn't handle it. Now, Garth Pratton did a study on battalion commanders in the Second World War, and he found something really pretty similar. So in 1939, the average age for a CO in the Second Australian Imperial Force was 43 years. By 1945, it had dropped to 30. So that's a pretty consistent thing. Now, it didn't drop, interestingly, when we were fighting in the Western Desert. It didn't dramatically drop through that period because we were vehicle mounted. But as soon as we got into the Pacific, it dropped significantly and quickly. So I guess there's a couple of lessons there for our junior officers in particular who are graduating. If the average age is 31, that means that there's a handful of 25, 26, 27-year-olds that are battalion commanders. These are your Charlie Greens of the next generation that are extraordinary individuals who get promoted rapidly into battalion command. The lesson for our current crop of COs is you're already too old for a war. And that's actually a pretty confronting thing. One, that's something that I certainly felt as I was being lapped by you guys. But yeah, that's physiology.
Yeah, I think the training officers and the staff cadets are loving the idea of being thrust straight into, despite it being a war-worn, fairly they should be nervous, but being thrust upon. But then to talk about the unit command, I suppose you don't think about it. You think about it as a troop command level, and you think, I'll be thrust into a combat team or company, and I might even switch hat badges or something like that. Whereas you don't think about it, I assume, as a CO until you talked about a PT session. But you sort of losing command immediately or being thrust straight up to then not be anywhere near sort of that physically demanding component of war.
Yeah, I think in a peacetime military like us, you sort of go, officers go in and out of battalions and regiments. Warrants actually spend far more time in units than what officers do. I think it's far harder on their bodies as well. But you get these periods where you can breathe a bit and rest a bit. You're not necessarily in body armour all the time. But I found that being a company commander at, say, 34, 35 years old, I was able to keep up, and it really wasn't a problem. Once you hit 40s and you're talking about a lot of wearing body armour, you have to put a lot of effort into maintaining your physical fitness at the same time as you're getting a whole lot of other pressures come down. I think, I mentioned before about the battalion commanders in the First and Second World War. It's not that there are none that are in their 40s. But I think Will Westerman describes them as the vigorous few that are still able to keep up at that level. And I think also it's a mental thing. I think that you become timid's probably an unkind word, but I think that you probably do become a little bit timid with age, as in you become more aware of your own physical limitations. There's a cracking example of this. Can I spin a war?
You definitely can, yeah. That's what we're here for.
Thank you so much. So Gordon Bennett, our youngest ever brigade commander, he is a 29-year-old commander of 3 Brigade in the First World War. At Pozieres, he's a CO, he's a battalion commander, and he's the kind of battalion commander that there's a great story of him at Pozieres where one of his junior officers was out somewhere in no man's land overnight. And he found out about it, and he personally went out into no man's land, found him wounded, and dragged him back personally. This is the sort of guy he is, right? Mm. This is a man who, 29, 30 and 31, was taking it to the Germans with his brigade beautifully. So fast forward now to the Second World War. And he becomes one of our most confusing and also maligned figures in Australian history, Australian military history, because he is the divisional commander at Singapore. He's commanding the 8th Division. He's defeated along with the rest of the British Army down the Malaya Peninsula, and he's part of that force that surrenders. But immediately before the surrender of his division, he leaves Singapore and he gets on a boat and he comes back to Australia. So his detractors will say that was cowardice. He would say that he was actually coming back because he was one of the few people who understood how to fight the Japanese because he'd done it and lost, and he could then reinvest that understanding back into an Australian army that was growing to fight the Japanese. Interestingly, his men who suffered through Japanese captivity and all of the deprivations that meant, they continued to love him, and even after the war, still loved him. So I've heard very experienced and officers that I respect say that essentially they think that what happened was he became more timid in old age. He was in his 50s by the time he's commanding a division in Malaya. So I don't know whether or not that's entirely true, but he's a very interesting example of how age affects an officer from hard charging in 1916, 17, 18 to dealing with defeat in perhaps not the best way in 1942. Yeah.
So when we talk about age, there must be, I suppose there's a difference between 1 div and 2 div and that interplay between the two. How do you think 1 div and 2 div now interact, and how does age come into that and the like in the fight?
So I think that, again, I'm going to lean on history here. So before Forces Command existed, we used to be divided into Land Command and Training Command. And Training Command had a role as being the custodian of mobilisation. There was the Chief of Staff in particular was one of them. Interestingly, General John Caligari, who we know from Townsville,
Hosted him for a dining in night, I think.
Cracking guy. He was one of the last in Training Command who, before Forces Command was formed. I asked him at the time, were you guys looking at mobilisation at all? His answer was absolutely not. It was 2007, 6, and that just wasn't anymore on the radar. The thing about the mobilisation plans through, from 1900 through the 70s, 80s, and that kind of stopped from about 1980, is just the numbers involved. So our army was about the same size, 30 to 40,000, say, or 27 to 40,000 throughout that time. The models that they were looking at were within 6 months, 75,000, within 12 months, 250,000 people, and then 18 months, maybe 700,000, but that was sort of in the never, wasn't really particularly looked at. I think that if we looked at 2 div and we looked at our structures within 1 div, I think that 2 div forms the basis of expansion from a structural point of view, if we needed it, but it's also not enough, right? Like even if we mobilise, or if we call out all of our reservists, we get to an army of about 45,000, of which how many are in headquarters roles, how many are too old based on what we've just discussed to actually serve in a frontline role. So there has to be something else. There has to be some other recruit training mechanism to take a whole lot of volunteers, or absolute worst case, a whole lot of conscripts, and turn them into soldiers. And I'm not privy to the plans to do that.
Touching on the part about the structure, like we always talk about, raising a fires brigade, the structure will be there, and everyone's like, where's the troops? Like that's the point that, soldiers are the people who achieve the end state, I suppose. But we talk about create a structure here and the rest will follow, create a structure here and the rest will follow. I suppose, are there any historical examples of that sort of approach and how it works from that context?
Yeah, so having hollow structures that are then fleshed out.
Because it seems like that is the current context. It's like, we've got a fires brigade, we'll put a brigade headquarters in as best we can, and then the rest will follow. I can't think of any specific examples other than to say that hollow structures can still be effective. I guess, again, I'll reach back to the First World War for this, but that 16th Battalion that we spoke about last time, Bullet Corps, where they went in with 1,000, their manning was 1,000 people, right?
they never, the strength states that I looked at were through until the end of 1917. I didn't go into 1918, but they could never achieve that 1,000 again. They were only at the sort of the 700, 800 mark ever in the rest of their history, from what I can tell. So what that means is that you look at ways to offset mass, and or the lack of mass. So you have more Lewis guns, for instance, in the platoon than what you did originally. So your platoon might only be 17 strong instead of 30 strong, but actually I've got my firepower is augmented by now having 4 Lewis guns instead of 2. Or there's ways to offset this sort of stuff. From an Australian context, I think my fear would be that we are so hollow as to be ineffective, and how do you make sure that you aren't? And I don't know quite what the answer is to that.
So we're talking about like wide sweeping change, and again, to loop back to our last episode, I talked about the tactical exercises in the 1st Brigade changing, but so too are the structures. Like I think 2023 was a point where the tactical tasks changed. So, I spoke about it last time, but that, 3 battle group assault from north to south down Mount Bundy changed completely to security area and stability operations in Darwin City itself, which was excellent. And then, insertion onto the Tiwi Islands. But so too, we saw a huge change in the structures in one brigade. I mean, 812, the gun regiment up in Darwin, lost one of their gun batteries, and it became the brigade's strategic sort of ISR component. Strategic is not the right word, tactical, at a brigade level, ISR, and they would insert first and then up into to screens and OPs to the north to coordinate some of that stuff. And then we lost, we have 5 RER, and they're sort of the only manoeuvrous element up in one brigade, and then subsequently re-rolled 1 CR into what was used to be task group goanna, obviously not manoeuvrist, which then sort of blurred the lines and rolled into a battle group goanna, conducting what is basically far more infantry-wide tactics than it is engineers. That structural change, like what I suppose that's what one brigade is doing currently, and trying to fill those, 101 battery into the ISR, so they become the ISR component for the brigade headquarters, and then no ACR and a 5 RER that's now small boats, and got rid of their PMBs for special operations vehicles. So I suppose that structural change is happening at a brigade level now. Sort of, are there any insights into that?
So I would say that that one brigade example where you're talking about engineers being used as infantry, I think that is a fine.
I'm oversimplifying it, by the way. So
Yeah, let's take that up to concept. That's fine as a concept for an ad hoc solution to things. Where I think that we would get into trouble is if that became structural, where we're using combat engineers who take a lot longer to train to conduct a task that can be done by somebody who can be trained to a much lower level. What we're doing in one brigade at the moment, I think, is trying to bed down some littoral experience that can then be used in a broader context across the army if it needed to be. And I think that's a worthy thing to do. I think that we can't lose sight of the limitations of that particular force, and that links back to the idea that that actually, to lodge and build a couple of airfields somewhere takes 2 brigades, not 2 companies. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a positive step for the Australian Army to be considering. Yeah,
and I think like from a organisational level, yes, trying new concept, not new, but like trying concepts of the past to completely change the way a brigade. It was from an individual perspective, and I suppose retention wise, although incredibly clunky, and it's always going to be because it's the first hit out of 2023 was the first hit out, but like. To see the money injected into the brigade to try those concepts was exceptional, but also like to do something that's completely different. You talked about warrant officers specifically being in units for so long, and I could only imagine how difficult the training gets year after year of deploying into the most dusty and arduous environments to then shift tack and go completely onto a different set of tactical tasks, yes, but a completely different experience on exercise, albeit very clunky. I think gives a purpose and a complete change to the way individuals fight. And hopefully it leads to, I'm going to make a massive leap here, but hopefully in the end, despite the clunkiness, we can sort of be grateful at an individual level that it's completely changed, like the way we do warfare, I suppose, at a brigade level. And we shifted tack in 1 year. Basically, from 1 year we went to, the traditional approach from Mount Bundy to the next year sort of doing something completely different with contracted barges. And I think it builds like not only from a conceptual basis, but hopefully it helps individuals find purpose in the brigade and stuff as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it also links to that age discussion that we were having before. Nimbleness of mind lessens with age. It's true. In 2012, I decided that I was going to invest in a Samsung Galaxy phone, and I hated it from day one because the interface was different from the iPhone that I'd been using for just 4 years. And now the thought of moving away from iPhone just makes me cringe. I don't have time to invest in that. And I think that's obviously a small and silly example, but
it's a daily, it's an example on the daily that is real, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So I think that's a positive to shake things up and make people think about the different ways of doing things. The next frontier, obviously, for us is in drone strike, counter drone, and how we actually tackle that as an army. How do our, for instance, how does one of our logistic nodes operate in that environment? We were obviously experimenting when we were in a brigade together with that threat, although that threat hadn't quite been made real in the way that it has since the Ukraine. But the amount of Russian trucks that you see on Twitter copying an FPV through the cab is just extraordinary.
Yeah.
So I think that nimbleness of mind is what's required to fix that. Yep.
Yeah, and to talk to that, I suppose what I want to come back to is that 30s, 40s example that we keep trying to, or the prime ministers and politicians keep trying to invoke. But how does age aside, how does 2 Div and 1 Div sort of interact in the, how do you see it playing out, noting your understanding of history?
So I think that 2 Div gets fleshed out as the first of the next divisions, but it's impossible to say how 1 Div units will be used. You can't really fall into that trap and think that you're going to be able to predict it. Good book, by the way, for anybody who wants to listen. Lawrence Friedman on Future of War. It's basically a study on how people have thought about the future of war previously, before the war. So this is in the 1900s, people were thinking that there was going to be airships flying everywhere and zapping things and stuff like that. So it's a great book. And essentially, while thinking about the future of war is critical, thinking that you can predict exactly how the interplay of all of these new technologies is going to play out is almost impossible. We've got 2 domains since the last conflict, space and cyber, and how are they actually going to challenge our ability to conduct military operations? I don't think anybody's entirely clear. And even the lessons from the Ukraine, our adversary would be different from who the Ukrainians are fighting. We would be in a littoral environment versus the plains of Eastern Europe. There's too many differences to be able to draw firm lessons, other than to say, it's definitely going to be different from what our last conflict was in Afghanistan, Iraq, or even Vietnam.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to label this, but the Afghanistan, we were both in Afghanistan at the same time, and I think the hangover from the Afghanistan days, noting that we're further, and I mean holding on to the way we fought in Afghanistan and holding on to the way we lived in Afghanistan and the like, knowing that we've moved some time between those 2 points and we've both obviously been there. What do you see as, have we left it behind now, or are we still holding on to it?
I'm going to answer that by saying that, firstly, My good understanding of this is probably 2 years old. So that's my first caveat. But what I would say is that what I observed with the people that we were working with in 3 Brigade was that there was an unwillingness to do things like dig in, camouflage, and those sorts of things that were a definite hangover from operating out of FOBs in Afghanistan and Iraq. A definite hangover of that time period. And I'm talking about at officer, senior NCO and junior NCO level. And it was also what our schools were teaching. Now, if I just list off those things again, digging in, camouflaging, what are we seeing a lot of in the Ukraine? Digging in and camouflaging. So I think that yes, that hangover of Afghanistan still exists. I think that as a profession, we need to banish it because the next conflict that we're involved in is probably unlikely to be a war of choice. Noting all the caveats I said about you can't tell exactly what the future character is going to be of the conflict, but I think it is fair to say it's going to be significantly different from Afghanistan if we do end up being involved. And I think there are cultural tells to that time period. So, for instance, there's one, just a few hundred metres from where we sit right now. Just across the way over the other side of Manica Oval is a Leopard 1 tank. Now, when we bought the Abrams tank, this is 2006-7-ish, sometime around then, we were operating Leopard 1s from the early 80s through to that period. We buy Abrams. And we then go through a process of gifting those Leopards to the RSLs around the country. But then look at the Ukraine, where they're desperate for Leopard 1s. And all of a sudden you start to go, maybe we should have put them in a warehouse somewhere and long-term stored them for either our own use for, the 2nd Armoured Regiment, or to gift to a worthy cause like the Ukraine. And I think that the tell for whether or not we've moved on from that thinking will be with the M113s. What are we going to do with M113 AS4s? Are we going to? I know we're using them as an autonomous experimental platform. Great, that's a great use. If we start seeing them outside of RSLs and the like, I would say that the hangover from Afghanistan and that period of long peace is still there.
Yeah. And I think that we will never fight that way ever again is just like, it's still somewhat ingrained. I mean, pre-Afghanistan I'm talking, but like heavy mechanised sort of, it just was not the thing. And it's got lighter and lighter, and we've got removed significant portions of our combat brigades and stuff to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And look, the M113 is not a perfect platform. It's old. It's all of those things. It'll still stop a bullet, and it still provides some sort of protection, and it's really light. Those are useful attributes for our region.
Yeah. I think you talked about camouflaging and sort of digging in and stuff, and then liking it to the Ukraine, where it's the realism is now like they're literally digging in, and it's perplexing to see a complete shift. But there's going to be sort of critics out there that are going to say that with thermal, camouflage does nothing. With the current artillery or offensive support that's available, shell scrapes do nothing. What would you sort of say to those people? And I know you said this for 2 years of command, so I've heard it definitely, and we trialled some awesome concepts out there. But how do we get that down to the soldiers to be like, it's real, like the threat is real, I suppose? Yeah,
I mean, so I don't know if you remember, we still run a chat from those days on Signal, and there was a great picture from Ukraine of a Russian loitering munition that actually got caught in a camouflage net and just got stuck there. Now, obviously, that wasn't intentional, but it was a good example of where actually this stuff can assist. I think that regardless of thermal imaging and everything else, the number one sensor on the battlefield for the foreseeable future will remain the human eyeball or a optimized version of that or mechanized version of that. So So that's the first thing. Camouflage can also be camouflage and deception.
Deception, yeah.
Is also critical. So if you remember, I can remember visiting your platoon position, Todd. But the idea that we were trying to, well, two ideas. One, a highly mobile logistic node, and another one was a dispersed logistic node. There's two different ideas there for how you defeat offensive support. The first one is highly mobile. I'm moving so often that they struggle to target me when they detect me, but noting that they're going to detect me. I don't know how valid that is now, having looked at the Ukraine. Not sure. The other one is what your CSST was doing, which was dispersing into platoon and below lots. That meant that if you were detected, one, they would struggle to work out what you actually were, and two, they would struggle to work out, well, do I really want to unmask my offensive support on something that's so small? Now, I think that second bit there, the unmasking piece, I think that's challenged by the sort of drones out there. Like, you're not actually unmasking necessarily if it's drones. My head was certainly more in your rocket and shell artillery when we were doing that concept. So I don't know if that's valid, but again, this is kind of the experimentation that you need to conduct to work out what might work and what won't. And then when you're actually in the situation, that's when you can adapt because you've already thought about it.
So we're bogged down in good warriors for a little bit there, following the conversation about the hangover from Afghanistan. But I suppose to go full circle back to the 1930s and 40s and the preparations that sort of mounted during those times, what was Australia's sort of approach? What was the approach?
Yeah, so last episode I read out a couple of quotes from our two most recent Prime Ministers on comparing our current circumstances to the 1930s and 40s. And I think it's interesting then, if you're going to compare, to actually have a look at what we did in the 30s and 40s. So in the official histories, there's actually a beautiful little passage that gives us a snapshot. So the Prime Minister was a guy called Joseph Lyons, who was Prime Minister from 32 through to the time that he died in office in, I think, 39 or very late 38. He faced a motion of no confidence in Parliament from the Labor opposition for basically being unprepared for conflict. Now, this is in the wake of the Munich Agreement. The Munich Agreement was basically where Germany, Italy, France, and Great Britain partitioned Czechoslovakia and gave the Germans the Sudetenland, and the British Prime Minister Chamberlain sort of waving a piece of paper saying, we now have peace in our time because of this. But there was a consciousness that perhaps it wasn't necessarily peace in our time, as evidenced by the fact that Labor's doing a vote of no confidence. So Lyons gets up in Parliament and he basically gives a shopping list of all of the things that his government has done. So the one caveat, I'm going to read out a significant part of this shopping list to you. The caveat is that this is a politician fighting for his career. So some of it is we're going to do this, or, maybe he's saying that we have done it, but actually it's a gunner. Anyway, so there a few of them. So acquired 3 light cruisers, which was the Sydney, Perth and Hobart. They modernised Australia's 2 heavy cruisers, the Australia and the Canberra. They converted the light cruiser HMAS Adelaide from coal to oil. Navy people should get excited about that. They commenced local construction of sloops, so that is gearing up industry to be able to start actually producing eventually the Bathurst-class corvette and the like. They increased the number of permanent seagoing personnel to 2,950. They started seaward defences at harbours, including booms and also boom defence vessels. So think around Sydney Harbour, Darwin and the like, just small ships and booms that meant that submarines and the like couldn't get in. They increased oil storage and reserves of naval stores and also ammunition. I guess we're doing some of that with the GWIO project, or we're at least recognising a need to do something like that. Improved the strategic naval wireless stations in Canberra and Darwin. Commenced fixed coastal defences at including anti-aircraft at the ports. The Royal Military College was expanded to increase throughput. Oh, that's interesting when you overlay the fact that we've just gone to 12 months, which should increase the throughput of officers. Command and Staff College was opened for the first time in July 1938. The Air Force were in the process of increasing from 2 squadrons to 7, and that was an increase in frontline aircraft from 30 to 198. So that's a pretty big percentage-wise increase. They established an aircraft industry with the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. They ordered additional aircraft from Great Britain that they struggled to actually get because obviously Great Britain was facing their own problems. They actually sent out and conducted surveys of Australian industry. So the sort of thing where if there was a factory that was producing Singer sewing machines, what tooling would be required to start making Bren guns or similar, and let's actually get that tooling in reserve so that when something happens, we can actually deploy that forward to those factories and get them moving. And then lastly, there was an increase in the volunteer militia force from to 70,000 people from a peacetime military of more like 20,000. So that was an intensive recruitment drive to do that. So I guess there's some really tangible things in that list that sort of Lyons put out there. And the question that I'm going to leave unanswered is, what are we doing right now as a defence force that a future Australian Prime Minister would get up and be happy to list off as an achievement when they were trying to stare down a no confidence motion? It's impossible to say whether or not, for instance, we've had a few little wake up calls, for instance. So Hong Kong becoming more absorbed into China's sphere of influence and in their way of government. Is that the equivalent to the Rhineland being reoccupied in 1936, or is it the equivalent of Anschluss in Austria being taken in 1938? There is no equivalent. There is no set timeline to a war and the lead up to a war. It's impossible to work that out. All you can really say is our politicians are saying these situations are similar to the 1930s and 1940s. Well, this is what we did in the 1930s and 1940s. What are we doing now that compares to that?
I think that's an awesome point on a rhetorical question to end this episode of the podcast. Obviously, co-host, so we're getting you back on, and we'll riff through some more. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.